the roar of German-built power. This is a garage in Greenside in Johannesburg where you can go if you want to buy an old Mercedes. It is one of South Africa's 3,000 second-hand car dealers. Like many, it fears the coming of the new Consumer Protection Act on April the 1st. It will mean no second-hand goods can be sold as is, a minimum 6-month warranty. It means dealers like this will be liable for any death, injury or economic loss.
I think the biggest fear for small merchants would be the costs that are first going to arise due to this new act. As a small business, you now have to possibly employ a couple of people who will be dedicated to dealing with the client, with checking.
So if you buy one of these cars and you feel it's not exactly what you paid for, you can appeal to an ombudsman. And then you can appeal again to a consumer commission. Maximum penalty is a heavy fine and imprisonment.
It's a whole different ballgame. The other costs that are definitely going to arise is insurance. We do have cover. Most reputable dealerships have cover, but you're really going to have to go through your insurance policy with a fine-tooth comb because of all the things that are implied in this new act.
Second-hand dealers say it all means the phrase caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, is no longer the case. Now, they say, it's let the seller beware.
This couldn't have come at a worse time for the second-hand car industry. I mean, first, a few years ago, there was the National Credit Act, which made it more difficult to get a loan to buy a car. Then there was the recession. What it all means is that if you take just a 10-minute drive from this forecourt, you'll find scores of second-hand car dealers who've closed down.
The government argues that the new act will lend the consumer greater protection and more power. They say it will give more certainty and transparency in transactions. A Thursday morning, the Department of Trade and Industry holds media workshops to argue their case and motives.
I think it's a recognized fact that we don't have a very strong consumer voice or consumer advocacy within the South African context. And as a consequence of that, the legislators saw a need that there must be in place some form of mechanism to make sure that we stimulate the consumer voice, but over and above that, that we stamp out all the consumer transgressions that are actually taking place within our market. So that obviously brought about the necessity for a legislation that would be enforceable and that would make it obligatory for suppliers and manufacturers to comply with whatever standards are put in place to protect consumer interests.
She also allayed fears of second-hand dealers around the country.
What we is envisaged is that obviously both a supplier, manufacturer and a retailer cannot escape liability by blaming the other party within the food chain. But what is envisaged is that at some point in time, the people in that food chain will make sure that the contracts are such that they protect themselves against potential liability from a consumer. But what we are concerned about is from a consumer point of view that a consumer should not be moved from pillar to post. It will then be incumbent on that particular retailer to make sure that they tie the manufacturer or the supplier to a contract that will ensure that it protects them in the long run, so that when a consumer does claim from them, they know that they have some alternative recourse. So at the end of the day, as the Commission, we are not saying only the retailer is liable. We're saying somebody in the value chain must hold that liability, but it cannot be left to the consumer to try and now prove who is in the value chain. So now the big players, for want of a better word, will then have to decide liability among themselves so that the consumer is not worse off as a consequence of transactions they enter into.
Another concern with the Consumer Protection Act is that it could delay the pace of doing business.
I don't believe so. I think what is important is for business to also understand the provisions of the Act in advance. Because at the end of the day, I think it can actually have a benefit to business to make in relation to making sure that their businesses are not only more efficient, but are actually more profitable. Because I think what business is looking at now is saying, oh my goodness, this will eat away at our profits, this will eat away at our market share. I don't believe so. Yes, you will find that one or two consumers will try and abuse the system, but we believe there are enough controls in the system to prevent against abuse. So even though there's a predisposition that it's biased towards the consumer, it's not necessarily the case. When you look at it, it does have that balance. But over and above that, I believe if business takes the time to properly understand the Act, then they will see that if they comply with the Act, it can actually have the effect of bringing more consumers to them. In fact, at some point, maybe we'll even reach a point whereby there'll be a grading that says, you know what, go to this particular manufacturer or supplier because they have a high grading in terms of the Consumer Protection Act. The same way you find with the green economy. 20 years ago, everyone thought it was a dirty word. Today, businesses actually attract consumers because they comply with green energy sources.
The DTI will also be holding seminars in March 2011. For now, though, the message could not be loud enough. If you want to sell second-hand goods in South Africa, make sure they are ready to roll.